Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Quick question for my fellow crime junkies. Where are you watching this from right now? Midnight scrolling in bed? Headphones in at the gym? Sneaking an episode during lunch break? Tell me where in the world you are and what device you're on. I love seeing how this community shows up. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're ready for more chilling stories. Tonight, we are going somewhere that is going to stay with you long after the screen goes dark. And I want you to hold on to that pillow a little tighter, because what happened in the quiet town of Holland, Michigan is the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about safety, about family, and about the people we trust most with our lives. This is not just a cold case. This is not just a headline from decades ago that faded into the forgotten corners of a filing cabinet. This is the story of a little girl who was failed by every single adult who was supposed to protect her. A girl who reached out for help and was ignored. A girl who told the truth and was not believed. And a girl whose body lay buried beneath concrete for more than 3 decades while the man who put her there walked free, sat at dinner tables, attended church, and lived his life as though he had done nothing wrong at all. Her name was Andrea Bowman. She was 14 years old. She had brown hair and green eyes, and a small birthmark on her right hip. She had been born in New Orleans, Louisiana, with the name Alexis Badger, a name her biological mother had chosen with love, with intention, with the kind of hope that only a teenage girl carrying a child she could not keep would understand. But Andrea would never know that name for most of her short life. She was placed for adoption at just 5 months old. She spent time in foster care. And then, at 21 months old, she was placed into the home of Dennis and Brenda Bowman, a couple who lived in Holland, Michigan. To the outside world, to the neighbors and the church community and the social workers who signed the paperwork, it looked like a second chance. It looked like the beginning of something good. But behind those walls, something was rotting. You need to understand the geography here before we go any further, because the place matters in this story. Holland, Michigan is not a dark and gritty urban landscape. It is not the kind of place you imagine when you think about monsters. It is a town of windmills and tulip festivals. It sits on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, and in the spring, the tulip fields bloom in wild explosions of color, red, purple, yellow, pink, so vivid and so beautiful that thousands of tourists drive from across the state just to see them. The community is tight-knit. It is a place where people know their neighbors, where churches are full on Sundays, where children ride bikes in the street and parents watch from the porch. It is, by every visible measure, the last place on earth where you would expect evil to take root. And yet, evil does not choose its geography. Evil chooses its victims. And Dennis Bowman had been choosing his victims for a very long time before Andrea ever entered his life. March 11th, 1989. That date is burned into the fabric of this case the way certain dates burn themselves into history. Not because the whole world took notice, but because the people left behind could never forget it. It was a Saturday. The weather in Holland in early March is still gripped by the last claws of a Michigan winter. Cold, gray, the kind of day where the sky presses down on you and the air smells like snow that hasn't fallen yet. On that morning, life in the Bowman household was proceeding the way it always did. Andrea was 14 years old, a teenager navigating a world that was, from every indication, not a safe one for her. She had a younger sister, Vanessa, a baby, and Andrea was expected to carry a significant part of the responsibility for that child. Not in the warm, sisterly way that older children sometimes bond with their younger siblings, but in the grinding, relentless way that children of parents who abdicate their responsibilities are handed duties that belong to adults. Andrea was, by many accounts from people who knew her, a girl who carried too much. She carried too much responsibility. She carried too much pain. And she had been carrying a secret so terrible that the one time she tried to tell the truth about it, the adults in her life chose not to believe her. By nightfall on March 11th, 1989, Dennis Bowman would contact the Holland police. He would tell them that his daughter had run away. He said she had been gone since that morning. He said she had taken her purple coat. He said she had stolen money from the house. $100, though he would later revise that number upward to $150, a small inconsistency that would go unnoticed at the time. He said she had a history of running away. He said he figured she'd come back. The police, by almost every account from people familiar with the case, did not press hard. They filed a runaway report. They did not treat it as a missing child. They did not launch an urgent search. They did not immediately question the inconsistencies in Dennis Bowman's story. They did what far too many law enforcement agencies did in 1989 when a troubled teenager from a difficult home disappeared. They filled out the paperwork and moved on. There would even be, in the weeks and months that followed, a warrant issued. Not for Dennis Bowman. Not for any adult who might have harmed Andrea. The warrant was issued for Andrea herself, for running away. A 14-year-old girl was wanted by the police not as a missing person in need of protection, but as a juvenile delinquent who needed to be brought back. That detail right there, that single, staggering detail, tells you everything you need to know about how this case was handled in the beginning. Andrea was not seen as a child in danger. She was seen as a problem. And the man who had created every one of her problems stood watching it all happen and breathing easy. The weeks that followed the disappearance were strange and quiet in the way that only small-town Michigan winters can be. There were whispers. People in the community began to talk in the way that people talk when something doesn't quite sit right, but they can't put their finger on exactly what. There were alleged sightings. Someone said they saw a girl matching Andrea's description at a local 7-Eleven. Someone claimed to have received an anonymous phone call suggesting she had been spotted somewhere. There was even a rumor, unverified, unsubstantiated, the kind of cruel gossip that tends to attach itself to teenage girls who disappear, that Andrea was pregnant. Each of these threads went nowhere. Each of them was absorbed into the growing narrative that Andrea Bowman was simply a troubled teen who had chosen to leave. In the 1980s, that narrative was devastatingly easy to sell, particularly for girls like Andrea, girls who had histories of instability, girls who had been adopted, girls who were already seen by systems and communities as complicated, as hard, as someone else's problem. Meanwhile, the Bowman family moved. Shortly after Andrea disappeared, Dennis and Brenda relocated from their Holland area home to Hamilton, Michigan, a small town nestled between Holland and Dorr, about 25 miles southwest of Grand Rapids. They brought their daughter Vanessa. They left without Andrea. And no one, not the police, not the neighbors, not the church, not the school system, not a single institution that was supposed to be paying attention, apparently found this alarming enough to investigate further. Dennis Bowman had reported his daughter missing, and then he had moved away from the last place she was seen, and life had continued. This is the part of the story where you have to sit with the discomfort of what systemic failure actually looks like. It doesn't look like a villain twirling his mustache in plain sight. It looks like paperwork not filed, like warnings not heeded, like a child who falls through every crack in every floor of every institution that was supposed to catch her. In 1991, 2 years after Andrea vanished, her face appeared on milk cartons. This was the era of the milk carton child, a well-intentioned but ultimately limited campaign that put photographs of missing children on the side of dairy containers in the hope that someone, somewhere, eating breakfast in their kitchen, might recognize a face. It was the 1980s and early 1990s version of viral sharing. Andrea's photo circulated that way. Her green eyes looked out from those cardboard containers into the kitchens of strangers who didn't know her, didn't know Holland, Michigan, didn't know anything about the weight she had been carrying or the secret she had tried to tell. She was a face on a carton. She was a name on a flyer. She was a missing person entry in a database that few people knew how to access. And the years kept passing. There is something that happens to a case when it goes cold. The energy of urgency drains away, and what is left behind is a kind of bureaucratic static. The case still technically open, still technically assigned to someone, but not at the top of anyone's desk. Not the thing that keeps anyone up at night except the people who love the missing person. And in Andrea's case, the people who were supposed to love her most were not the ones losing sleep. Her birth mother, Kathy Turkanian, did not even know for certain that Andrea was missing. Kathy had made an impossible choice as a teenage girl. She had given up her baby, a decision made under pressure, made from fear, made in the way that very young women in very desperate circumstances sometimes make decisions that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. She had named her daughter Alexis, and then Alexis had disappeared into the adoption system, and Kathy had disappeared into her own life. Carrying the grief of that surrender the way you carry something too heavy to put down, but too painful to keep holding. The case of Andrea Bowman sat in its file. The years became a decade. The decade became two. Holland, Michigan held its tulip festivals. Families came and went. Children grew up and moved away. And somewhere beneath the earth, the truth was waiting. You know, there is a particular kind of silence that settles over a town when a tragedy is unresolved. It's not the silence of peace. It is the silence of unfinished business. And Holland, Michigan carried that silence about Andrea Bowman through the 1990s and into the new millennium without ever fully reckoning with what it meant. To most people who had heard the story, it was settled. She ran away. She was a troubled kid. She probably ended up somewhere, living some kind of life. People told themselves comfortable stories because comfortable stories are easier to live with than the alternative. But not everyone accepted the comfortable story. And it would take one man with a particular set of skills and an obsession born out of loss to begin pulling at the threads. Carl Coppelman was not a detective. He was not a law enforcement officer. He was not employed by any government agency with the authority to investigate crimes or compel testimony. He was an amateur in the truest and most extraordinary sense of that word. Someone who pursued his passion not for money or recognition, but because something inside him demanded it. Coppelman had become deeply immersed in the world of unidentified human remains through what began as an interest in forensic art. He had taught himself to create facial reconstructions, computer-generated images built from descriptions of unidentified bodies, from bone structure analyses, from the fragments of a person's physical identity that death leaves behind. He worked with the NAMUS database, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, a federally funded resource that collected information on both missing persons and unidentified remains in the hope that the two sides of that terrible equation could be matched. In a world where technology was finally beginning to catch up with decades of cold cases, Coppelman had positioned himself at an unusual and invaluable intersection. Someone who understood both the visual and the statistical dimensions of these mysteries. He had seen thousands of cases. He had worked on dozens of them, contributing his reconstructions to law enforcement agencies, posting them online in the hope that someone might recognize a face, might have a memory that could unlock a file that had been sealed for years. And somewhere in his deep dive through the NAMUS database, he came across a Jane Doe case out of Racine County, Wisconsin. A young woman's body had been discovered, and she had never been identified. The details of her case, her approximate age, her physical characteristics, the circumstances of her discovery, began to nag at Coppelman. He couldn't quite explain it, the way investigators often can't quite explain that first flicker of recognition that tells them two pieces belong together. He started comparing what he knew about the Wisconsin Jane Doe to what he knew about missing persons cases from the region. And one name kept swimming up through the data: Andrea Bowman. The potential connection was not ironclad. It was, at this stage, nothing more than a theory, the kind of theory that amateur investigators have to handle with enormous care, because the stakes on both sides are devastating. If you are wrong and you raise a family's hopes, you cause a fresh wound in a person who has already been bleeding for years. If you are right and you fail to pursue it, a victim stays unidentified and a family never gets answers. Coppelman proceeded carefully. He worked with what he had. He compared the physical descriptions. He looked at age and geography. He built his case the way a good analyst builds any case, methodically, with documentation, with the constant awareness that evidence has to be able to stand up to scrutiny. It was around this time that another person entered the orbit of Andrea's case from a completely different direction. Kathy Turkanian had been living her life in the years since she gave up her baby girl. She had built a life for herself, the way survivors do. Not easily, not without scars, but with the kind of tenacious forward motion that comes from having no alternative. She had never stopped thinking about Alexis. That was the name she had given her daughter before the adoption, Alexis Miranda Badger, and it was the name Kathy held on to in the private spaces of her heart even as the world knew the child as Andrea Bowman. The years had passed, and Kathy had wondered, was she okay? Was she happy? Had the family that took her been good to her? These were the questions that lived quietly in the background of Kathy's daily existence, never loud enough to paralyze her, never quiet enough to let her fully rest. Then, in 2010, a letter arrived. It was from a social worker. The letter told Kathy that her biological daughter had disappeared from her adoptive home in Michigan back in 1989. It told her that police were investigating a new lead, that her daughter might be a Jane Doe found in Wisconsin. A dead girl. Police needed a DNA sample from Kathy to know for sure. The letter was sparse. It did not include the adoptive name. It did not include the city in Michigan. It did not include any contact information for the investigating officers. It was, in its blunt inadequacy, a perfect example of how institutions communicate tragedy to human beings, with the minimum possible information and the maximum possible impact. Kathy read the words. She read them again. Her daughter might be dead. Her daughter, the baby she had named Alexis, the baby she had handed over in the belief that she was giving her a better life, might be dead and unidentified, lying in a Wisconsin morgue as a Jane Doe. Kathy did what Kathy would demonstrate again and again throughout this story was her defining characteristic. She did not crumble. She moved. She got on the internet, and she searched. She searched for missing girls in Michigan. She searched by birthday and by physical description. She filtered and she looked, and she scrolled through the kinds of pages that no parent should ever have to scroll through. Missing children pages, cold case forums, the digital graveyards of the unaccounted for. And she found Andrea Bowman. The school photograph, the brown hair, the green eyes, the age, the timeline. Kathy looked at that photograph, and she saw herself looking back. She saw her own features, the family resemblance that biology writes into the bones and the face with its own quiet insistence. She was almost certain. This girl with the name she hadn't been given was her daughter. She submitted her DNA, and then she waited. And while she waited, she did something extraordinary. She created a Facebook page for Andrea. She created a classmates page. She wanted to reach people who had known this girl, who had known her at school, who had been in her orbit during the years when Kathy couldn't be. And those pages became gathering points. Old friends and neighbors and former classmates found them and began posting. And through those posts, a picture of Andrea's life began to take shape. Not the sanitized, paperwork version, not the runaway narrative that Dennis Bowman had constructed, but the lived reality of a child who had been struggling, who had been hurting, who had been trying to tell people that something was wrong inside that house. What people wrote broke Kathy's heart and hardened her resolve in equal measure. There were people who remembered Andrea as a bright, funny, spirited girl. They remembered specific moments, a laugh in a hallway, a kindness extended on the playground, the particular way she held herself when she was trying to be tough even though she was clearly frightened. They remembered the signs of a child in distress. They remembered the injured wrist. They remembered the isolation that had been growing around her in the period before she disappeared. And one woman, a friend named Jennifer Jones, came forward with something that cut through all the noise and went straight to the heart of what had been happening in the Bowman house. Jennifer said that before she disappeared, Andrea had confided in her. She had told Jennifer that her father was sexually abusing her. She had said it plainly, in the way that children who have finally decided to trust someone will sometimes say something unspeakable plainly, because they have held it so long that the weight of it forces the words out. Jennifer had not known what to do with that information at the time. She was a child herself. She had not had the framework or the support or the knowledge to set in motion the kind of institutional response that might have saved Andrea's life. Another woman, Arlene Ron, had reached out to authorities before Andrea disappeared and raised alarms about the Bowman household. She had said that something was wrong in that home. She had expressed concern about Andrea's well-being. Her warnings had been noted and, by every available evidence, not meaningfully acted upon. This is the pattern that runs through this case like a fault line running through rock. Warning signs, red flags, disclosures, adults who saw, who heard, who worried, and a system that looked away. Every time someone moved in the direction of the truth was not ready for them, or the institutions were not ready for the truth, or both. And in that gap, Andrea continued to suffer. And then she was gone. By the time Kathy had found the Facebook pages and connected with Carl Coppelman, the two of them, a grieving biological mother and a self-taught forensic artist who had never met Andrea and yet could not let her go, formed one of the most unlikely investigative partnerships in this story's long and painful arc. They were not official. They had no legal authority. They could not compel anyone to do anything. But they had something that official investigations sometimes lack when cases go cold. They had personal investment that did not diminish with the passing of years and the accumulation of other cases. They had obsession, in the most human and most necessary sense of that word. The DNA results from the Wisconsin Jane Doe comparison were pending. The wait was agonizing. And while Kathy and Coppelman and everyone else connected to this case held their collective breath, a retired Michigan detective named Pat O'Reilly was telling Kathy something that she already suspected but needed to hear from someone with a badge. O'Reilly, by Kathy's account, was direct in a way that official responses rarely are. He told her that the case had been botched from the beginning. He told her that the person she needed to be looking at was Dennis Bowman, not the Wisconsin Jane Doe, not some unknown assailant, not the ghost of a runaway narrative. Dennis Bowman, the man who had been looking Kathy and the world in the eye for 20 years and saying he didn't know where his daughter was. The DNA results came back, and they were not a match. The Wisconsin Jane Doe was not Andrea. She was someone else's daughter, someone else's unresolved agony, a mystery that belonged to a different family and a different case. The relief was strange and incomplete, the way relief always is when the news is both better and worse than expected. Better because Andrea had not been identified as dead in Wisconsin. Worse because it meant she was still out there somewhere in the uncertainty, still missing, still unaccounted for, still lost in a system that had never truly been looking for her with the urgency she deserved. For Kathy Turkanian, the negative result did not slow her down for a single day. If anything, it sharpened her focus. Because now the question was no longer which Jane Doe might be her daughter. The question was the one that had been circling this case like a hawk circling a field. Where was Andrea, and what had Dennis Bowman done to her? Kathy had been talking to enough people by this point, reading enough accounts, hearing enough fragments of story from the people who had known Andrea in life, that she had formed a conviction that would prove to be entirely correct and entirely maddening in the years that it would take to prove it. She believed Dennis Bowman had killed her daughter. She said it plainly. She said it publicly. She told anyone who would listen. And the police, who had suspected Bowman for years but could never find the evidence to arrest him, kept investigating within the limits of what law and evidence required, while Kathy kept pushing with the kind of force that only a mother's grief can generate. To understand Dennis Bowman, to really understand who this man was and what he was capable of, you have to go back before Andrea. You have to go back to a sunny morning in May 1980, to a 19-year-old woman riding her bicycle along Lakeshore Drive north of Holland, Michigan. She was doing what people do on spring mornings in beautiful places. She was simply living her life, moving through the world in the uncomplicated way that we take for granted until something shatters it. And on that morning, a motorcyclist pulled up alongside her and forced her off the road. The man told her to get off her bike and walk into the woods. The young woman did not move. She stood there, rooted by fear and something else, some instinct, some refusal. And in that frozen moment, a passing car came along the road and the motorcyclist was distracted. The woman ran. She ran and she made it, and she survived. Bowman fired 2 shots during the incident. Neither shot found its target. The woman escaped. Dennis Bowman was identified, arrested, and eventually convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct in connection with that attack. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. A judge specifically noted at sentencing that Bowman would likely pose a danger to women if released. That determination was not speculation. It was not judicial rhetoric. It was a professional assessment based on what the court had seen of Dennis Bowman, based on his behavior, his psychology, his pattern. And yet, Bowman served the minimum sentence. He served 5 years. He was released. And when he was released, he went back to Holland, Michigan. What happened in that house on that March morning in 1989 was, by Dennis Bowman's own eventual and grudging account, a confrontation. Andrea had told him she was leaving. She had threatened, by at least one account, to report his abuse. And Dennis Bowman, a man who had already demonstrated that he was capable of extraordinary violence against women and girls, did not let her go. He slapped her, he would eventually claim. He struck her during an argument, and she fell backward down a steep staircase. He would frame it as an accident. He would return to that framing again and again in the years after he finally confessed, as though the word accident could bear the weight of what he had done, as though it could transform the deliberate silencing of a child into something less than murder. But the physical evidence, when it was finally recovered, told a different story. The body told the story that the man could not suppress even with decades of careful lying. Because Dennis Bowman did not call 911. He did not try to help Andrea. He did not run to a neighbor's house in a panic. He did none of the things that a person who has accidentally caused a terrible injury does. What he did was begin the process of concealment. He dismembered his daughter's body using first a machete, which, by his own subsequent description, was not working efficiently enough, and then an axe. He used an axe to sever her limbs so that her body would fit into a barrel. He placed the remains in trash bags along with household garbage. He initially buried her at the Holland area home they were renting at the time. And then, when the family moved to Hamilton, he transported those remains, his daughter's remains, and buried them again, deeper this time, under a concrete slab in the backyard of the new house. And then he sat on top of that secret for 30 years. Kathy Turkanian knew none of these specific details yet. What she knew, by the time she had been researching this case for several years, was enough to be certain. She had gathered testimony from Andrea's friends and classmates. She had spoken with investigators who had worked the case and who confirmed what they suspected but couldn't prove. She had connected with people who knew the Bowman family from the inside. She had assembled a portrait of Dennis Bowman that was, by any reasonable measure, the portrait of a predator, a man with a documented history of violent sexual aggression, a man who had been found dangerous by a court of law and then handed a child anyway, a man who had been accused by his own daughter of abuse and had responded by making sure that daughter could never accuse him again. She began to say it publicly, not in a whisper, not in the careful, hedged language of people who are afraid of legal consequences. She said it clearly and repeatedly. Dennis Bowman killed my daughter. She said it to journalists. She said it to investigators. She said it on the Facebook pages she maintained for Andrea. She said it in the way that a woman says something she has fought to know and is not going to unsay simply because the institutions around her are moving more slowly than her grief. And the Allegan County investigators, to their credit, had never stopped watching Dennis Bowman. They had executed multiple search warrants on his property over the years. They had interviewed him. They had conducted surveillance. But without a body, without physical evidence that could definitively link Bowman to his daughter's death, the case remained exactly what it had been since 1989, a suspicion without a charge, a truth without a verdict. There was one moment in those years of surveillance that investigators and people following the case would return to again and again. When police searched the Bowman property in Hamilton, the concrete slab in the backyard had drawn attention. It was not a new structure. It had been poured years ago. It had the look of something utilitarian, something practical, the kind of poured concrete feature you find on properties all over rural Michigan. A pad for equipment or storage, something permanent and unremarkable. But to people who were looking for where Dennis Bowman might have hidden the truth, it looked like exactly what it was. It looked like a lid. Investigators could not, without probable cause that met the legal standard, simply tear it up. The law does not work on hunches, even correct ones. And so the concrete slab sat there, and the years continued to pass. Then, from an entirely unexpected direction, the case cracked open. It happened at a conference. That detail always strikes people as almost too mundane to be real. The kind of thing you'd expect to happen in a movie, where the dramatic revelation comes in a grand, cinematic moment, not in the fluorescent-lit, coffee-and-name-badge reality of a professional gathering in a conference hotel somewhere. But that is precisely where it happened. A detective from the Michigan State Police and a detective from the Norfolk, Virginia Police Department both happened to be attending the same cold case homicide conference. Their conversation began, as professional conversations do, with the exchange of case details, the kind of informal information sharing that happens between law enforcement professionals who operate in different jurisdictions and who sometimes find, to their surprise, that they have been chasing the same ghost from different directions. The Michigan detective was familiar with the Andrea Bowman case. He had been working it. The Norfolk detective had a different problem. He had DNA evidence from a 1980 murder scene in Virginia, but no suspect to match it to. He had been carrying that evidence for years, working the genealogy angles, trying to trace the biological family lines that the DNA represented. Genetic genealogy, the use of public DNA databases to identify suspects through their family connections, had transformed cold case investigation in the years since the Golden State Killer case brought the technique to public attention. Investigators across the country were going back to old evidence with new tools, running the genetic profiles of unknown killers through consumer DNA databases, tracing family trees, narrowing down suspect pools until they could legally obtain a DNA sample from a specific individual and make a definitive comparison. The Norfolk detective had done exactly that work on the murder of Kathleen Doyle. Kathleen Doyle was 25 years old in September 1980. She was the wife of a United States Navy pilot who was deployed at the time of her death. She was found murdered in her Norfolk home, raped and killed, the case going cold for nearly 4 decades as the methods available to investigators fell short of identifying a suspect. But the genetic genealogy work had done what the older methods had not. It had pointed toward a family. It had pointed toward Michigan. It had pointed toward an Allegan County connection. And when the Norfolk detective sat down with the Michigan detective at that cold case conference, and they began comparing notes, the name Dennis Bowman floated up from both sides of the conversation at the same moment. The Michigan detective had DNA from Bowman collected in connection with the Andrea investigation, a sample that could not, without corresponding physical evidence from a crime scene, prove anything in Andrea's case. The Norfolk detective had DNA from Kathleen Doyle's murder scene. The question was whether they matched the same man. They did. The DNA was conclusive. Dennis Lee Bowman, the man who had been suspected for 30 years in the disappearance of his 14-year-old adopted daughter, was the man who had raped and murdered Kathleen Doyle in Norfolk, Virginia in 1980, just months after his conviction in the Michigan assault case, and at a time when Andrea was still a toddler in his care. He had not simply attacked a woman on a bicycle and been punished and reformed. He had continued. He had taken a life. He had buried that crime for 4 decades as successfully as he had buried everything else. In November 2019, law enforcement moved. Dennis Bowman, then 70 years old, was arrested at his home in Allegan County. The arrest was made in connection with the Kathleen Doyle murder. That was the charge they had the evidence to bring, the Virginia crime with the DNA confirmation. In Michigan, the Andrea investigation intensified with renewed purpose. Because with Bowman now in custody, facing the certainty of prison for the rest of his life, the calculus of his silence had changed. He had nothing to strategically gain from continuing to protect his secret about Andrea, and perhaps, in the darkest and most self-serving region of his psychology, something he needed to unburden. The interrogations began, and this is where the multiple versions of Dennis Bowman's story reveal themselves in all their calculated and shifting ugliness. Bowman did not immediately confess to everything. He did what guilty people often do when they know the game is over, but are still trying to manage the narrative. He gave ground incrementally, releasing pieces of truth in the order that served him best, shaping each admission around the framing of accident, of unavoidability, of things going wrong despite his best intentions. He was, in this, consistent with the personality that investigators and experts had always described. A man of extraordinary control, someone who had spent decades managing the perceptions of everyone around him. His first version, delivered during a conversation with Brenda in December 2019 while he was being held in Michigan pending extradition to Virginia, was that he had slapped Andrea during an argument and she had fallen down the stairs. He said she had died from the fall. He said he had panicked. He said he had put her body out with the trash. He told Brenda, his wife of decades, his partner in the story of Andrea's runaway, this version in a conversation that was being recorded. And Brenda sat with it. Brenda, who had stood by him through the 1980 conviction. Brenda, who had absorbed the disappearance of her daughter in 1989 and accepted whatever explanation he had given her at the time. Brenda heard this version and, by subsequent testimony, began processing the information the way people process information that destroys everything they thought they knew about their life. But the investigation was not finished with Dennis Bowman's versions. Because as investigators continued to work on him, as the pressure of the Virginia murder charge made the pretense of ignorance less tenable, Bowman shifted his account again. He was talking about Andrea. He was giving more detail. And the detail that emerged from subsequent confessions was not the detail of an accident. It was the detail of a man who had, with deliberateness and method, destroyed all evidence that his daughter had ever existed. He had used a machete first. When the machete wasn't sufficient for the task, he had switched to an axe. He had dismembered her body so that it would fit in a barrel. He had buried the barrel. He had moved it when the family moved. He had poured concrete over it. He had walked over that concrete slab for years. He had lived on top of her. And then, in a conversation with Brenda in February 2020, he He told her where Andrea was. He said it in the oblique, maddening way that he said most things, so near, so far, right under your nose. Brenda, by her own testimony, did not immediately understand what he was saying. She told him that couldn't be right. They hadn't lived in Hamilton when Andrea disappeared. He told her he had moved her. She was in the backyard, under the concrete. Brenda testified about this conversation later. She described the moment she understood what he was saying. She described what it felt like to realize that she had been living above her daughter's remains for years. That the concrete she had walked past and around and never fully thought about was not just a concrete slab. It was a grave. It was the place where Dennis Bowman had hidden the truth of what he had done, and the truth of who he was, and every lie he had ever told about the girl who had run away. The investigators who received this information from Brenda moved with the urgency the case had always deserved and never received. They obtained the necessary warrants. They assembled a forensic team. They went to the Hamilton property, and they began to dig. February 2020. The property in Hamilton, Michigan. A forensic team arrived in weather that was exactly right for the gravity of what was about to happen. Cold, overcast, the bare trees of a Michigan late winter standing against a gray sky like witnesses. There were dogs brought in to work the ground. There were tents set up to shelter the work from the elements and from public view. There was a quiet, methodical quality to the initial excavation that those who have worked crime scenes will recognize. The stillness of professionals who understand that what they are about to find will require both technical precision and human care, and who honor both. The concrete slab was there, right where Bowman had said it was. It had sat in that backyard for years, through investigations, through search warrants that had touched other parts of the property, through all the years when Kathy Turkanian and Carl Coppelman and retired Detective Pat O'Reilly and everyone else who knew the truth was screaming into institutional silences. The slab was not particularly large or particularly remarkable. It was just a piece of hardened concrete in a yard. Except that it was not just a piece of hardened concrete. When they removed it, when the forensic team began working the earth beneath, they found her. What remained of Andrea Bowman? The girl who had been born Alexis Badger in New Orleans, Louisiana, who had been placed into foster care at 5 months old, who had been adopted into the Bowman household at 21 months, who had spent her entire short life in the care of a man who should never have been within 1,000 miles of a child. Those remains were there, dismembered and bagged and buried, as Dennis Bowman had described, but there, present. Finally, after 31 years, present. The forensic team recovered the remains carefully. DNA was extracted. Samples were sent for comparison against Kathy Turkanian's profile, which had been on file since the Wisconsin Jane Doe investigation years earlier. And within weeks, the comparison came back positive. The remains were Andrea's. The child who the world had been told ran away, who had been labeled a runaway and issued a warrant and dismissed as a problem teenager, was where she had always been, in the backyard of the man who killed her. She had never left. She had never run. She had been there the whole time. Kathy Turkanian got the call confirming the identification. By multiple accounts from people who know her, Kathy is not a woman who collapses. She has spent too many years being the only force in motion on this case to allow herself the luxury of stopping. But this call was something different. This was not a theory confirmed. This was not a connection made. This was the body of her daughter. This was Alexis, found in the worst possible way, in the worst possible place, after the worst possible 31 years. And Kathy had been right. She had been right when law enforcement had not believed her strongly enough to act, when the case had sat in its file going cold while she burned with certainty. She had been right about all of it. She later told reporters and documentary filmmakers that she felt both broken and vindicated in the same moment, which is one of the most honest and most painful things a person can say. Vindication without joy. Correctness without comfort. This is the particular hell of the families who pursue cold cases for years. They fight and they push and they refuse to accept the silence. And when they are finally proven right, what they have been proven right about is the death of someone they loved. Dennis Bowman was still in Michigan at this point, being held pending his extradition to Virginia for the Kathleen Doyle murder. The discovery of Andrea's remains added new charges to the accumulation of justice that was finally closing around him. In Michigan, he was charged with open murder, felony murder, first-degree child abuse, and mutilation of a body. These were the charges that reflected the full horror of what the physical evidence. His daughter's dismembered remains in a buried barrel under a concrete slab, confirmed about what he had done. Because it was not, by any reasonable interpretation of the evidence, the story of a man who accidentally caused a death and panicked. The deliberate dismemberment, the acquisition of tools, the burial, the concealment, the years of maintenance of the lie. These were the actions of a man who had planned, who had calculated, who had executed with the same cold efficiency he had always brought to the business of being dangerous. In February 2020, Bowman was extradited to Virginia to face the Kathleen Doyle charges. He pleaded guilty in a Norfolk, Virginia court to the rape and murder of Kathleen Doyle. He received 2 life sentences for those crimes, along with an additional 20 years for burglary connected to the same case. 2 life sentences for Kathleen Doyle, and the Michigan charges for Andrea still waiting. Dennis Bowman, the man who had lived in Holland, Michigan, attended church, been known in his community, was now in a Virginia prison serving consecutive life sentences and facing the prospect of a Michigan trial that would force out every detail of what he had done to his 14-year-old daughter. For Brenda Bowman, the woman who had stood by this man through every chapter of his violence, the path forward was genuinely complex. She had lost a daughter to him. She had lost a marriage to him. She had lost the version of her life that she thought she had been living. She had also, by the testimony that would emerge in the subsequent legal proceedings, been complicit in ways that she would have to reckon with publicly. Brenda testified in the preliminary examination hearings in the Andrea case. She testified about the conversations she had had with Dennis. She testified about what she had known, and when, and what she had done or not done with that knowledge. Her testimony included the admission that Andrea had accused Dennis of molesting her before she disappeared. Brenda testified that she had not believed her daughter. She had not believed the child in her care when that child told her the most difficult truth a child can tell. She had, in the way that partners of abusers sometimes do, chosen the abuser. And Andrea had paid for that choice with her life. Judge William Belargin, reviewing the evidence from the preliminary examination, found sufficient probable cause to proceed toward trial on all charges. The case was ordered forward. And in December 2021, Dennis Bowman appeared in Allegan County Circuit Court and entered a plea of no contest to second-degree murder in the death of Andrea. A no-contest plea is not an admission of guilt, but for the purposes of sentencing, it is treated as one. Bowman looked different from his earlier appearances. Older, slower, the 74 years he now carried visible in the stoop of his posture and the gray of what remained of his hair. He confirmed to Judge Margaret Zuzik-Backer that he was entering the plea. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. February 7, 2022. The sentencing hearing. The courtroom was full. Kathy Turkanian was there. Investigators who had worked the case for years were there. And Dennis Bowman was there, physically present in the room where the legal accounting for his actions would be delivered. Judge Backer sentenced him to 35 to 50 years in prison for the second-degree murder of Andrea Bowman. The sentence was to run consecutive to his Virginia life sentences, meaning that Dennis Bowman would die in prison. There was never going to be a world in which this man walked free again. Judge Backer's words from that sentencing have been reported widely, and they are worth sitting with. She said that Bowman is a serious, dangerous man who has harmed many communities and many families. She said it was impossible to find the words to describe what he had done. She said that reading what he had done was sickening. These were not the polite, measured words of judicial procedure. They were the words of a judge who had read the file and felt what the file required a human being to feel. And outside that courtroom, Kathy Turkanian told reporters, "I'm sad, but relieved he finally told the truth. It's been a very long, difficult journey, but I did it all because I love Alexis." Alexis, not Andrea. Alexis, the name her mother had given her. The name she had been born with and had never been allowed to carry in life. The name she would carry in death, because Kathy had decided that her daughter deserved to go forward into whatever comes after this world with the name she had been given in love, not the name given to her in a process that had placed her in the care of a killer. Let's go back. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, because the full weight of this story is only felt when you understand every layer of it. Not just the crime and its discovery, but the life that was lived inside it, and the systems, and the people, and the choices that made it possible for it to go on as long as it did. You need to know who Andrea Bowman really was, beyond the case file, beyond the milk carton photograph, beyond the runaway label that was hung around her neck like a stone. You need to know her as a person, because this story is about a person, and people deserve to be seen in their full complexity. She was born in New Orleans in 1974. Her biological mother, Kathy Turkanian, was a teenager at the time, young, frightened, and operating without the safety nets that she needed. Kathy had her own history of hardship. She was a girl who had run away from her own difficult circumstances at 14, the same age, bitterly, that Andrea would be when her life was taken from her. Kathy was not in a position to raise a child in the way that a child deserves to be raised. The pressure from her family was significant. The societal pressure on single, teenage mothers in the mid-1970s was significant. And so Kathy made the decision to place her baby for adoption, a decision she would describe in later years with a grief that never fully healed, a decision she made in the genuine belief that she was doing the best possible thing for her daughter, that she was handing Alexis to a future that would be safer and more stable and more full of possibility than anything Kathy could provide at that moment in her life. Catholic Charities handled the adoption. There would emerge later, in the accounts that Kathy gathered from people who had known the Bowman family, a deeply troubling detail about the placement, that the adoption agency may have told the Bowmans that Alexis potentially had fetal alcohol syndrome because Kathy had consumed alcohol during the pregnancy. This claim, if it was made, appears to have been false or at minimum speculative. But its impact on the quality of the placement, on the level of care and attention that the adoption agency brought to ensuring this particular child was going into a genuinely safe and appropriate home, is something that haunts the margins of this case. Because the Bowman home was not an appropriate home for any child, and a more rigorous assessment of the family's background, an assessment that fully accounted for Dennis Bowman's history, should have made that clear before Alexis Miranda Badger ever became Andrea Bowman. She arrived at the Bowman home as a toddler, a small child with green eyes and brown hair and a birthmark on her right hip in the late 1970s. Dennis was serving out the remainder of his prison sentence for the 1980 assault by the time she was school age. Actually, wait. Let's be precise about the timeline because it matters. Dennis was convicted of the 1980 assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct and sentenced to 5 to 10 years. He served the minimum. So he was out of prison by the mid-1980s, at which point Andrea was a young child in his household. The family, Dennis, Brenda, Andrea, and eventually Vanessa, lived in the Holland, Michigan area. To the outside world, they presented as a normal family. They had a house. They went to church. The children went to school. Dennis worked. Brenda worked. The machinery of suburban normalcy functioned on the surface. But inside that house, Andrea was not safe. Friends who knew her in the years before she disappeared have described, in retrospect, and with the clarity that retrospect brings, a child who was increasingly burdened and increasingly afraid. The isolation was noted. The change in personality that sometimes accompanies chronic trauma in children was noted. The responsibilities that were placed on Andrea with regard to her younger sister Vanessa, responsibilities that exceeded what should be expected of a child her age, were noted by people who visited the home or interacted with the family. Andrea was not being raised in the way a child deserves to be raised. She was being used. She was being deployed, in the way that abusive households sometimes deploy their older children as supplementary caregivers, in a way that obscured the dysfunction while simultaneously contributing to it. And then there was the abuse itself, the sexual abuse that Jennifer Jones testified Andrea confided to her before she disappeared. The abuse that Andrea reportedly reported to authorities, an accusation that was met, as so many such accusations were met in that era and are still sometimes met today, with skepticism and inaction. The abuse that Brenda Bowman would later testify Andrea had accused Dennis of, the accusation that Brenda testified she had not believed. The abuse that was, according to Detective Sergeant Todd Workman's account of the investigation, a direct precipitating factor in what happened on March 11, 1989. Andrea was going to leave. She was going to report Dennis again. And Dennis, who had spent his entire adult life calculating risk and managing exposure, knew what that meant. He knew what it would cost him. He made a choice. The fight that Dennis described, the slap, the fall down the stairs, was his most benign version of what happened. And even that version, stripped of the subsequent dismemberment and burial, represents a man who caused his daughter's death and then made deliberate, methodical choices about concealment rather than accountability. Even if you take his most charitable account at face value, you are looking at a man who chose concealment over his daughter's life, who chose his own freedom over truth, who spent 30 years lying to the police, lying to his wife, lying to anyone who asked. The reality, as the evidence showed, was significantly worse than his most charitable account. The physical evidence of the dismemberment tells a story that goes beyond panic and reactive concealment. The tools he used, the efficiency with which he proceeded, these speak to a man who had thought about disposal, who had the psychology of disposal already within him, perhaps because he had already done something similar before, in Virginia, a decade before Andrea disappeared. The Kathleen Doyle case deserves its own full reckoning, because Kathleen Doyle was a person, too. She was 25 years old. She was the wife of a Navy pilot. She was living in Norfolk, Virginia, in her home, on a September morning in 1980, when Dennis Bowman, who was in Virginia at the time, reportedly visiting family, entered her home and raped and murdered her. Her husband was deployed. She was alone. And Dennis Bowman, who had already been convicted of a violent sexual attack in Michigan, who was already a documented predator, found her and killed her, and then went back to Michigan and back to his life, and back to his church, and back to the house where Andrea was growing up. Henry Lee Lucas, the notorious false confessor who claimed responsibility for hundreds of murders he could not have committed, had been linked to the Doyle case for years, clouding it with the confusion that his false confessions generated throughout the law enforcement community. The real perpetrator had been invisible behind that confusion. But DNA does not confess falsely. DNA does not care about the narratives we build. And the genetic genealogy work that finally pointed investigators toward Dennis Bowman's family line was precise and patient in a way that all of Dennis Bowman's decades of careful lying could not ultimately defeat. When investigators in 2021 followed up on additional leads generated by Bowman's arrest and confession, he also admitted to a rape and assault that had taken place in 1979, a year before the Doyle murder, a year before the bicycle attack that led to his Michigan conviction. The victim was a 27-year-old woman from Holland. This was yet another layer in the history of a man who had been engaged in sexual violence against women and girls for as long as he had been an adult. From 1979 forward, the earliest confirmed incident, through 1980, through the years of Andrea's childhood, through 1989 when he killed her, through 1998 when he was convicted of breaking and entering at a female neighbor's home, Dennis Bowman's life was a continuous thread of predation against women and girls. He was not an ordinary man who made one terrible mistake. He was a serial predator who had been given, over and over again, the benefit of a doubt he had never earned. This is the part of the story where you need to stay with me, because what comes next is where the institutional failures compound in ways that should make every one of us think hard about how we construct the systems we rely on to keep people safe. Because Dennis Bowman didn't operate in a vacuum. He operated in a world of neighbors and teachers, and social workers and law enforcement officers, and judges and church communities. He operated in a world where people saw things and heard things and worried about things, and sometimes reported things. And the systems that received those reports, that processed that information, that held the authority to intervene, those systems failed. Not because the people in them were evil, but because systems that are under-resourced, overextended, and built on assumptions that favor the stability of families over the safety of children within those families will always, in cases like this one, choose the wrong direction. By this point in the story, you may be asking yourself a question that haunts every case like this one. You may be asking, where was everyone? Not just the police, not just the social workers, not just the adoption agency. Where were the neighbors? Where were the teachers? Where were the pastors and the coaches and the extended family members and the friends of the family who moved through the Bowman's world and should, at some point, have seen something that was too wrong to ignore? This is not a question born of blame. It is a question born of the desperate need to understand how a child can suffer so visibly and so loudly and still not be saved. And the answer is as old as abuse itself. Abusers are, in the main, extraordinarily skilled at managing the perceptions of everyone around them. They are experts at the performance of normalcy. They are masters of the gap between what is shown to the world and what is done in private. Dennis Bowman had been performing normalcy for decades. He had done it through a prison sentence. He had done it through the disappearance of his daughter. He had done it through search warrants and police interviews and the scrutiny that comes with being a known suspect in a long unsolved case. He was, in this terrible sense, a professional. What people outside the house did see were the signs that children in abusive households emit. Signs that are, in retrospect, unmistakable, but that are, in the moment, surrounded by the plausible deniability that adults tend to extend to families that look ordinary from the outside. Andrea's withdrawal, her sadness, the weight of responsibility that she carried, visible to anyone who spent time around her. The injured wrist that was noticed at school, and that should have, by any reasonable child protection protocol, triggered a more thorough investigation. These were signals. They were not subtle. And yet, each one, in isolation and without the context that comes from knowing the full story, could be explained away as adolescent moodiness, as the ordinary difficulties of a child navigating a complicated home life, as the kinds of things that children go through that don't necessarily require the involvement of protective services. It was not until Kathy Turkanian began gathering the testimonies of Andrea's friends through the Facebook and classmates pages she had created that the full picture emerged in its devastating clarity. Friend after friend contributed pieces of the puzzle, specific memories, specific incidents, the consistent pattern of a child who was suffering in plain sight. Jennifer Jones's testimony about Andrea's disclosure of sexual abuse was particularly devastating because it established that Andrea had not merely been suffering in silence. She had tried to tell someone. She had trusted a friend with the truth. And that truth had not, through the failures of childhood resources and the inadequacy of support systems available to children who disclose abuse, found its way to someone with the power to act on it in time to save her. There is a separate thread in this story that runs alongside the main investigation, and that speaks to the broader scope of Dennis Bowman's danger in the community. In 1989, the same year that Andrea disappeared, a 6-year-old girl was kidnapped in Holland, Michigan. She was abducted and assaulted and survived. The case went unsolved. For 30 years, that victim, whose name has never been publicly disclosed, lived with the knowledge of what had been done to her, and without the knowledge of who had done it. When Dennis Bowman was arrested in 2019 and the investigation into his history intensified, this victim came forward. She told investigators that she now believed she knew who had abducted her in 1989. She pointed to Dennis Bowman. Investigators began looking into the possibility. Evidence from the attack, rope, clothing, was submitted for DNA testing to explore the potential connection. Bowman was never charged in that case, but the investigation speaks to the scope of what this man represented to the communities where he lived and worked. He had been working near Holland at the time of the 1989 abduction, staining wood for boats, a job that placed him in the geographic area of the attack. His physical description matched the composite that investigators had developed. And the timing, 1989, the same year as Andrea's disappearance, the same year he was moving between properties and managing the concealment of his daughter's body, suggests a man operating in a period of intense predatory activity, a man for whom the boundaries between his crimes were not as distinct as the separate case files made them appear. Carl Coppelman, through all of this, had continued his work. His role in this case evolved over the years from the initial forensic artist work that had first connected him to the Wisconsin Jane Doe investigation into something broader, a kind of tireless advocate for the case's visibility, someone who kept the story of Andrea Bowman alive in the true crime community and in the online spaces where cold cases are discussed and pursued by the people who care about them. It was not glamorous work. It was not the work of someone seeking credit or recognition. It was the work of someone who had looked at a missing child's photograph and decided that her case deserved more than a file folder. The true crime community's involvement in this case is worth examining honestly, because it represents both the best and the most problematic aspects of citizen engagement with unsolved crimes. On the best side, Kathy's Facebook pages and the community that grew around them became a genuine resource. People came forward with memories and information that would otherwise have been lost to time, and some of that information directly informed the official investigation. The online attention kept the case visible in an era when law enforcement resources are finite and cold cases compete for diminishing attention. On the more problematic side, Anytime a community of non-professionals begins speculating about a specific individual's guilt in a public forum, the potential for harm, to the investigation, to individuals wrongly accused, to the integrity of eventual prosecutions, is real. The true crime community, at its best, supplements official investigation. At its worst, it can compromise it. In this case, the balance tipped toward the constructive side, in large part because Kathy and Coppelman and others were careful to channel their certainty into pressure on official channels rather than into vigilante action. By the time the Hamilton property was excavated in February 2020, the Michigan State Police and the Allegan County Sheriff's Office had been working the case for years with genuine seriousness. Detective Lieutenant Todd Workman of the Michigan State Police had been on the case since 2018 and would play a central role in the interrogations of Bowman that ultimately produced the confession and the direction to the burial site. The joint effort between Michigan and Virginia, the two investigations converging, sharing evidence, building toward the same man from different directions, was, as Allegan County Prosecutor Myrene Koch described it at the sentencing press conference, a model for how cold case collaboration can work when the right people are in the same room at the right time. And that room was a conference hotel somewhere, and the two detectives were drinking bad conference coffee, and the name Dennis Bowman came up from both sides of the conversation at the same moment. And that was the beginning of the end for Dennis Lee Bowman. If you are still watching this, I want you to pause for just 1 second and hit that subscribe button right now. I know you are invested in this story. I can feel it through the screen, and there is so much more to tell. Hit subscribe so you never miss a case. Hit the like button so this story reaches more people who need to hear it. Now let's keep going. Because the sentencing hearing in February 2022 was not the end of this story for everyone who was left standing in its wake. For Kathy Turkanian, the legal resolution of Dennis Bowman's case was a landmark, a necessary milestone, but not a destination. There were things still undone. The most immediate and most personal of those things was the question of what would happen to Andrea's remains. After the forensic work was completed and the identification was confirmed, the question of custody, of who had the right to claim the body, to arrange a burial, to make the decisions that families make for the people they have lost, was contested and painful in the way that questions of custody always are when a child has been failed by so many people in so many different ways. Kathy wanted Andrea's remains. She wanted to give her daughter a burial. She wanted to bury her as Alexis Miranda Badger, the name she had been born with, the name Kathy had given her, the name that represented the biological connection and the love that had always been there, even across decades of separation. She told reporters after the sentencing hearing, "I spent 10 years trying to see that happen, and I love Alexis. Not Andrea. Alexis." The reclamation of that name was not incidental. It was the whole point. It was Kathy insisting that her daughter had existed before the Bowmans, that she had been someone before she was placed in that house, that she had a history that preceded the story Dennis Bowman had imposed on her, a story that had ended with her buried under concrete. Alexis had existed before Andrea disappeared, and Alexis was who Kathy was going to bury. There is a woman you need to meet properly before we go any further, because she is, in many ways, the most extraordinary person in this entire story, and she has not yet been given her full due. Her name is Kathy Turkanian, and she was 14 years old when she ran away from her own home, the same age that Andrea was when she disappeared. Kathy grew up in difficult circumstances. She knew what it was to be a child without adequate protection. She knew what it was to be on her own in a world that was not designed to be kind to young women without resources or support. She got pregnant as a teenager and she made the hardest decision of her life, the one that she believed at the time was the right decision and the generous decision and the decision that would give her daughter the safe and stable future that Kathy herself had not had. She placed Alexis Miranda Badger with Catholic Charities. She was told the child would go to a good family. She was promised that her daughter would be well cared for. She was given the assurances that adoption agencies give to mothers who surrender children, the language of happy endings, of better lives, of children who are loved in the homes that receive them. And Kathy moved forward. She built a life. She carried the grief, and she did not stop moving, the way survivors do, because stopping is not an option when you are the kind of person Kathy is. For years, many years, she did not know what had happened to Alexis. The adoption had been closed. which is the legal arrangement under which the biological parent and the adoptive family have no contact and no access to information about each other. Kathy could not look for Alexis without the appropriate legal mechanisms in place. She could not pick up the phone and call the Bowmans. She could not write a letter that would reach her daughter. She lived with the uncertainty the way adoptive mothers live with it, as a background hum, constant and inescapable, present in the quiet moments and in the moments she worked hard to fill with noise. The letter from the social worker in 2010 broke the background hum and replaced it with something much louder. "Your daughter may be dead." 3 words that changed everything. And Kathy did not receive those words and retreat into grief. She received those words and moved forward into them with everything she had. She went online. She found Andrea. She created the Facebook page. She started talking to people. She pushed into the case with the force of a mother who had been denied access to her child for her child's entire life and was not going to be denied access to the truth of what had happened to her. When Pat O'Reilly told her that Dennis Bowman was the person she needed to be looking at, Kathy was not surprised. She had already arrived at that conclusion through her own research. She had been reading the accounts of Andrea's friends. She had been listening to Jennifer Jones's testimony about the abuse disclosure. She had been processing the pattern of signs and warnings that nobody had acted on in time. She knew. She knew it the way that certain truths announce themselves to you with a certainty that precedes evidence. Not as wishful thinking or paranoia, but as the logical conclusion of everything you have seen and heard and read and been told by people who were there. She told people Dennis Bowman had killed her daughter. She told law enforcement. She told anyone who would listen. And when law enforcement could not yet act on what she was saying, because law enforcement requires evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny and not just the moral certainty of a bereaved mother, Kathy kept the case alive in the only ways available to her. She kept the Facebook pages active. She continued to gather testimony. She continued to push. Year after year after year, she pushed. There is something that the people around Kathy describe about her that is worth naming explicitly. It is not just her persistence, though her persistence is remarkable. It is her clarity. In a case full of shifting narratives and institutional evasions, and the kind of fog that long cold cases accumulate, Kathy was always clear. She knew what she was looking for. She knew who she was looking for. She knew who had taken Alexis from the world, and she refused to let anyone around her forget it. This clarity, this insistence on the truth in the face of all the reasons to give up and accept the comfortable story, is what kept the case alive long enough for the Virginia detective and the Michigan detective to find each other at that conference in 2019. If Kathy had grieved quietly and gone home, this story might still be unresolved. The case might still be a cold file. Dennis Bowman might have died of old age in a house in Hamilton with his secret intact, with Alexis still buried in his backyard. She didn't let that happen. She didn't let it happen because she loved her daughter with the fierce and uncompromising love that biological connection carries, even across decades of separation, even across the absence of any shared experience, even across the horrifying knowledge that the life she had wanted for Alexis had been the opposite of what Alexis had received. She loved her daughter, and love, in this case, was the engine that drove everything. The documentary series, Into the Fire, which covered this case and brought it to a wider audience, featured Kathy speaking directly about her relationship with Alexis, the daughter she had never heard speak, had never received a phone call from, had never shared a meal with as an adult. The words she used have been quoted widely because they are simply that devastating. She said she didn't know if Alexis was left-handed or right-handed. She said she didn't know what her voice sounded like. She said Alexis had never said, "I love you, Mommy." She had never called her Mommy. And yet, Kathy said, she was her mommy all the way to the bone. This is one of those statements that lands in you and does not leave, because it captures the particular grief of a mother who lost her daughter not once, but twice. First to adoption, then to murder, and who carried that double loss with a dignity and a determination that defies everything you might expect from someone in her position. She wanted to bury her daughter as Alexis. She wanted to give her a proper burial, a ritual, a ceremony, a marked place in the world that said, this person existed, this person was loved, this person deserved better than what she got, and she is not forgotten. The legal process of obtaining custody of Andrea's remains after the forensic examination was, like everything in this case, not simple. But Kathy pursued it with the same focused persistence she brought to everything else. She was going to see her daughter buried properly, with her real name, with the love that had always been there even when circumstances had kept it from being expressed. The case also generated, in the aftermath of the sentencing, a renewed examination of the systems that had failed. The adoption system that placed Alexis in a home with a documented violent predator. The law enforcement response in 1989 that treated a missing child as a runaway. The warrant issued for Andrea rather than for her abuser. The failure to act on the abuse reports that had been made before she disappeared. These are not abstract institutional failures. They are failures with a face and a name and a small birthmark on a right hip. They are failures that killed a child. And they are failures that are still happening, in different forms, in different cases, in different cities. The structures that allowed Dennis Bowman to hide are not fully dismantled. The tendencies that led to Andrea being labeled a problem child rather than a child in need of protection are not fully gone. The reflexes of systems that prioritize family stability over child safety, that disbelieve children who report abuse, that treat missing teenage girls as runaways rather than victims. These reflexes are still present in the culture and in the institutions that were supposed to protect Andrea and didn't. That is why cases like hers matter beyond their individual facts. That is why the story of Andrea Bowman, of Alexis Badger, needs to be told completely and honestly and with every uncomfortable detail in place. Because if we cannot look at what happened to Alexis and ask, with honesty and with the willingness to be changed by the answer, why it happened and how we keep it from happening again, then we have failed her a second time. Now I want to take you into the interrogation room. I want you to see Dennis Bowman the way the detective saw him. Not as the community member, not as the church-going, boat-staining, neighbor-waving man that the people of Holland and Hamilton had known for decades, but as the person he was when the walls came down and the DNA evidence was sitting on the table across from him and the options had narrowed to almost nothing. Because the way a person behaves in an interrogation room after decades of successfully concealing the worst things they have ever done tells you something fundamental about who they are. It tells you whether there is any genuine remorse, or whether the admission, when it comes, is simply the last available calculation of a person who has been calculating his whole life. Dennis Bowman, by every account from the investigators who spoke with him, was the second kind. Detective Lieutenant Todd Workman of the Michigan State Police, who had been on the Andrea case since 2018 and who worked closely with the Norfolk investigators after the connection between the two cases was established, has described Bowman as giving multiple different versions of events. Not a single confession, clearly and cleanly delivered by a man who had finally decided to unburden himself. Multiple versions, shifting accounts, the incremental release of details that is the signature of a person managing a narrative even in the face of irrefutable evidence. The first version, the one he gave Brenda in December 2019, was the staircase story. The slap, the fall, the accident. He put her in a box and put her out with the trash. In this version, he was a man who had made a terrible mistake, who had acted in anger and created a consequence he hadn't intended, and who had panicked. It was, as confessions go, strategically minimized. It acknowledged his involvement without acknowledging the full horror of what he had done. It positioned him as a man who had lost control for a moment rather than a man who had calculated every subsequent step with the precision of someone who had done something like this before and knew how to manage the aftermath. This version did not survive contact with physical evidence. Because the physical evidence, the dismemberment, the tools, the barrel, the burial, the reburial when the family moved, did not speak to panic and a loss of control. It spoke to method. It spoke to preparation. It spoke to a man who had thought about what to do with a body. The investigators pushed. Bowman gave more. The machete, the axe, the barrel, the bags of household garbage mixed in with the remains, the concrete slab, each detail delivered reluctantly, each one a further concession extracted by the pressure of what investigators already knew and what the evidence required him to acknowledge. And through all of it, the framing remained the same. He had struck her. She had fallen. He had not intended for her to die. He was not a murderer. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake and then made worse ones trying to hide it. This is the story Dennis Bowman told because it was the story that served him best, even in extremis. Even at the end. Even at 70 years old, with 2 life sentences already secured and a 3rd prison sentence now being added to them, Dennis Bowman was still managing his narrative. Still calculating. Still performing. The judge was not moved by the performance. It's impossible to even articulate the words to describe what he has done, Judge Badger said at sentencing. Reading what he has done is sickening. These are not the words of a court that accepted the accident narrative. These are the words of a court that had read the full file, that had heard the testimony, that had absorbed the totality of Dennis Bowman's history, from the 1979 rape in Holland to the 1980 murder in Virginia to the 1980 assault in Michigan to the years of abuse of Andrea to her death in 1989 to the decades of concealment, and had rendered a judgment not just on the specific charge, but on the man. The preliminary examination had included Brenda Bowman's testimony, and it is worth spending a moment with Brenda, because hers is a complicated position in this story and one that deserves careful treatment. Brenda Bowman is not Dennis Bowman. She did not kill Andrea. She did not dismember her. She did not bury her under the concrete. But she did stand by the man who did. She stood by him through his 1980 conviction. She stood by him through the years of Andrea's abuse. She stood by him through 30 years of the runaway story. And when Andrea had come to her and said that Dennis was molesting her, had said the thing that a child in that situation says when they have finally found the courage to tell someone, Brenda had not believed her, had not acted to protect her, had chosen Dennis. By Brenda's own testimony in the preliminary examination, she had not known about the murder until Bowman told her from prison in 2019. But if you are looking for the story to end with a feeling of peace, I have to be honest with you about where peace is in this picture. Peace is not fully available in a case like this. Not when the systems that failed Andrea are still largely in place. Not when children are still being failed by the same reflexes, the disbelief of abuse allegations, the runaway label for missing teenagers, the institutional tendency to prioritize family stability over child safety. Not when there are Kathy Turkanians in the world right now, today, pushing against walls that are not moving because their child is in danger and the system has not yet caught up. The case of Andrea Bowman, of Alexis Badger, is a case about a specific crime committed by a specific man, but it is also a case about everything that made that crime possible and everything that allowed it to remain unresolved for 31 years. It is about what we owe to children. It is about what we owe to mothers who are right when we tell them they are wrong. It is about what justice looks like when it arrives 3 decades too late and still matters enormously, to the people who have been living in its absence. Let me take you back to March 11th, 1989, one more time. But this time, I want you to be inside that day rather than outside it. I want you to feel the texture of it, not the abstracted facts of a case file, but the lived reality of what it was like to be a 14-year-old girl in that house on that morning. Because this part of the story is often told in the third person and at a distance, and the distance does something terrible. It makes the victim into a subject, a case number, a set of circumstances rather than a person. And Andrea Bowman was a person. She woke up that morning. She had made a decision, or she was in the process of making a decision, or the confrontation that precipitated everything happened in the organic, unplanned way that confrontations between people living in impossible proximity sometimes do. She was going to leave. She was going to say what she knew and take herself out of the situation. She was 14 years old, which means she was old enough to understand the weight of what she was about to do and young enough to still believe, at some level, that doing it was possible, that someone would listen, that telling the truth about Dennis Bowman would result in Dennis Bowman being stopped. She may have already told Jennifer Jones. She may have already told other friends who have not been publicly named. She had already, at some earlier point, reported the abuse to some authority. That report had not produced the intervention it should have produced, but she had made it. She was not a child who had given up. She was a child who kept trying. What Dennis Bowman did on that morning ended her ability to try. And then he spent 30 years. That knowledge, the knowledge of someone who has already gotten away with murder once, changes the calculus of everything that happens next. It explains the efficiency of the dismemberment. It explains the method of the burial. It explains the confidence with which he constructed and maintained a runaway narrative, because he had already proven to himself that he was capable of hiding a murder that the systems around him were not going to find what he did not want found, that if you controlled the initial story and kept your composure through the subsequent questions, you could make a crime disappear. He had done it before. He did it again. The runaway narrative was, in its construction, almost elegant in its simplicity. It required nothing from Dennis Bowman except the maintenance of a single story. She ran away. She had done it before. She took money. She had her coat. She is probably out there somewhere. It required him to be appropriately sad but not devastated, appropriately cooperative but not overeager, appropriately concerned about his daughter in the generic way that a father whose troubled teenager has left home might be concerned, without the specific, driving desperation of a parent whose child is genuinely missing and whom they know to be in danger. He had read the situation correctly. He knew that the police were primed to accept a runaway story for a troubled teenager. He knew that the social context of the time, the 1980s, with its particular set of assumptions about troubled teenagers and broken families, would do much of the work for him. And it did. The police accepted it. The school accepted it. The community accepted it. The case went cold. The family moved. Andrea's face appeared on milk cartons and then faded from them. Years passed. Decades passed. And the only people who did not accept it were the people who did not yet have all the information they needed to prove what they suspected. The investigators who kept Bowman in their peripheral vision, and eventually Kathy Turkanian, who arrived at the case from the outside and saw it with the clarity of someone who had no investment in the comfortable story. The comfortable story is a recurring villain in cold cases. It is the story that closes files too early. It is the story that is told about missing women and girls who are too easily categorized as runaways, as sex workers, as people whose lives suggested that disappearance was a likely outcome, as people whose absence from the world was somehow less urgent because of who they were or where they came from or what their family situation looked like. Andrea Bowman fell into that category. She was adopted. She was from a complicated home. She had a difficult relationship with her parents. She had reportedly left before. She fit the profile of the kind of girl who runs away, and Dennis Bowman knew she fit that profile, and he used it. This is the kind of targeted exploitation that predators engage in, not just the physical violence, but the strategic use of the victim's context and vulnerability to manage the aftermath. Bowman had selected a victim whose circumstances made the runaway story believable. He had spent years creating those circumstances. The isolation, the difficult home environment, the history of conflict with the family. All of it served the story he was going to tell. Whether that was fully conscious or partly instinctive is impossible to know. What is clear is that it worked. It worked for 30 years. Let me tell you about the people who kept refusing to let it work. Because there were more of them than Kathy and Carl Coppelman. There were investigators at the Allegan County Sheriff's Office who had never fully closed the book on Dennis Bowman, who kept his name in the active file even as the case went cold, who continued to execute search warrants on his property when they had the authority and the justification to do so. There were retired detectives like Pat O'Reilly who told Kathy directly what they suspected. There were friends of Andrea's who had carried their knowledge for decades and who, when they finally had a place to put it, Kathy's Facebook page, the investigators who came to them in the renewed investigation, gave everything they had. There were journalists who covered the case and kept it in public view. There was the true crime community, with all its complexity and all its dedication, that kept Andrea's story circulating through the digital spaces where cold cases sometimes find new life. And there was Detective Brian Fuller of the Michigan State Police, who was working the Andrea case when he crossed paths with the Norfolk detective, who understood immediately what the convergence of their information meant, who described the conference meeting as the catalyst that moved us forward. There is something almost mathematical about the way this case cracked open. The right information in the right hands at the right moment. The intersection of two investigations that had been running in parallel and unknown to each other for years, finally meeting at a hotel conference somewhere in Virginia and producing the lead that would eventually bring Dennis Bowman to justice for both his crimes. The Allegan County Sheriff Frank Baker put it simply and truly at the sentencing press conference. He said the major break in the case came from that chance meeting at the cold case conference. A chance meeting. After 30 years, after all the warrants and the surveillance and the interviews and the search warrants and the accumulated effort of everyone who had ever tried to crack this case open, it came down to a chance meeting between two detectives who happened to be in the same place at the same time, who happened to start talking, who happened to realize that the name they were both carrying was the same name. This is the reality of cold case investigation. It is not always the dramatic technological breakthrough or the genius deduction that changes everything. Sometimes it is proximity and conversation and the willingness to say, out loud, the thing you have been carrying around for years. Before we go to the courtroom, before we sit through the final legal reckoning, I want to talk about what it means to live in the community where something like this happened. To be a neighbor of the Bowmans. To have gone to school with Andrea. To have attended the same church, shopped at the same stores, driven past the same houses. Because the aftermath of a case like this is not just felt by the people directly involved. It spreads through a community like a shockwave, and the reverberations are felt long after the immediate crisis is over. People who lived near the Bowmans in Hamilton have described, in various accounts, the strangeness of the revelation. You drove past that house. You might have seen the concrete slab in the backyard from the road, or maybe not. Maybe it was too far back, tucked into the yard in the way that concrete structures sometimes are on rural Michigan properties. But it was there. The house was there. Dennis Bowman was there, moving through the ordinary transactions of his daily life, buying groceries, filling his car with gas, living on the surface of a normal existence, while below the ground in his backyard, his daughter lay buried. The neighbors who have spoken about this describe a disorientation that is hard to put into words. The world did not look different after the revelation, but it felt different. The ordinariness of a place where something unspeakable happened takes on a different quality once you know. The school that Andrea attended, the teachers who had her in their classes, the classmates who had known her and who had scattered into the decades and built their own lives. These people received the news of Bowman's arrest and Andrea's discovery in different ways. For some, it was confirmation of a suspicion they had carried for 30 years. For others, it was a shock. For many, it was both. The Facebook pages that Kathy had created became, in the aftermath of the discovery, gathering places for a kind of communal grief. A grief for the girl who had been in their classrooms, who had sat at desks near them, who had laughed and struggled and reached out for help and not been adequately helped. People wrote about her. They shared photographs. They described specific memories with the tender specificity that people bring to the remembering of someone who is lost. Jennifer Jones, the friend to whom Andrea had disclosed the abuse, spoke publicly about carrying that knowledge for decades. She had been a child when Andrea told her. She had not known what to do. She had not had the resources or the framework to translate a friend's disclosure into a protective intervention. That kind of survivor guilt, the guilt of the bystander who is not equipped to act and must live with the consequences of that inability, is a real and serious psychological burden, and Jennifer Jones carried it for 30 years. When the case finally broke, when she was able to speak publicly about what she knew, there was a dimension of release in it. Not peace exactly, but the release of having been able to say, at last, the things she had known and had nowhere to put. Arlene Ron, who had raised alarms about the Bowman household before Andrea disappeared, represented another thread of that same experience. She had seen something. She had said something. She had done the thing that the awareness campaigns tell you to do. If you see something, say something. And the something had not reached the people who needed to act on it in time. For women of a certain age, this experience is not unusual. They were raised in a time when the formal systems for child protection were less robust than they are now, when the cultural tendency to treat family matters as private was even stronger than it is today, when the gap between a concern raised and an action taken was enormous. They raised the alarm. The alarm did not produce the response it needed to produce, and a child died. The case of Andrea Bowman became, in its aftermath, a reference point in discussions about child protection policy, about how law enforcement handles reports of missing minors, about the particular vulnerability of adopted children and children in foster care. The specific failure of Andrea's case, the fact that she was immediately classified as a runaway, that a warrant was issued for her rather than a search conducted for her, that the police did not pursue the inconsistencies in Dennis Bowman's account with the urgency they deserved. These failures speak to practices that were, in many jurisdictions, standard in 1989 and that have since been, at least in some contexts, reformed. But they have not been fully reformed everywhere. And the tendency to classify missing teenage girls as runaways rather than victims persists in ways that continue to cost lives. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has long tracked the disparity in media attention and law enforcement response between different categories of missing persons. Disparities that break down along lines of race, age, gender, and socioeconomic status. Missing white women and girls received, historically, more coverage than their black, indigenous, or women of color counterparts. But even within the category of white women and girls, there was a hierarchy. Adult women were taken more seriously than teenage girls. Teenagers from stable, middle-class families were taken more seriously than teenagers from complicated, low-income, or otherwise marked backgrounds. Andrea, as an adopted child with a difficult home life who had reportedly run away before, fell in the lower prestige category of that hierarchy. She was not the missing child who generated urgent searches and media coverage. She was the missing child who got a file and a warrant and a milk carton and the steady accumulation of years. The reforms that have happened in the intervening decades, the improvements in how missing children cases are handled, the growth of the NAMUS database, the availability of genetic genealogy as an investigative tool, the broader awareness in law enforcement about the risk factors that distinguish runaways from abduction victims. These are real and meaningful improvements. They might, had they existed in 1989, have changed the outcome of Andrea's case. They might have led investigators to the concrete slab sooner. They might have broken through Dennis Bowman's confident management of the narrative before 30 years had passed. But the improvements are not complete, and they are not evenly distributed. And in the communities and the jurisdictions and the family situations where the old patterns still operate, where a missing teenage girl is still too quickly a runaway, where an abuse accusation is still too easily disbelieved, where a man with a criminal history is still too readily extended the benefit of institutional doubt. Children are still vulnerable to the same failures that killed Andrea. This is why we have to keep telling these stories. Not for horror, not for spectacle, not for the particular human appetite for true crime narratives that this genre sometimes serves in ways that are more voyeuristic than constructive. We tell these stories because they contain information. They contain the specific, concrete, illustrated instructions for how systems fail and what the failure costs. They contain the faces and the names and the birthmarks and the green eyes of children who were real people and whose deaths were not inevitable, were not predetermined, were not the unavoidable outcome of troubled circumstances. Their deaths were the outcome of specific choices made by specific people and the failure of specific systems to intervene. And if we understand those choices and those systems clearly enough, we have the possibility, the obligation, of doing better. I want to talk to you now about genetic genealogy, because it was the technology that cracked this case open, and it deserves to be understood in its full significance. Most of you have heard of the Golden State Killer case, the investigation into Joseph James DeAngelo, the California serial killer who was identified in 2018 through the use of genetic genealogy after decades of hunting. That case brought the technique to public consciousness and created both enormous enthusiasm and serious ethical debate about how consumer DNA data should be used in criminal investigations. But the fundamental concept, using family DNA to identify an unknown suspect, had been developing for years before the DeAngelo arrest, and its application to cold cases has produced results that no other investigative method has been able to achieve. The way it works, in simplified terms, is this. If a DNA profile from a crime scene is uploaded to a consumer DNA database like GEDmatch, the algorithm can identify partial matches with other users in the database. These partial matches represent biological relatives, cousins, second cousins, more distant relations, who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to the database for ancestry research or family history purposes. The investigator then takes those partial matches and begins building family trees, using publicly available genealogy records, census data, birth and death records, and other documentation to map the biological family of the unknown DNA. The goal is to narrow the family tree down until a specific individual who fits the demographic profile of the suspect, the right age, the right sex, the right geographic location, can be identified as the likely source of the crime scene DNA. At that point, investigators can seek a legal DNA sample from that individual, a discarded coffee cup, a cigarette, butt, anything the person has touched and left behind, and make a definitive comparison. This is the process that the Norfolk investigators applied to the DNA from Kathleen Doyle's murder scene. 40 years of cold had left that evidence intact. The DNA was there. The genealogy database work pointed toward a family in Michigan. The geographic narrowing pointed toward Allegan County. And the convergence with the Michigan State Police investigation into Andrea's disappearance, where investigators already had a DNA sample from Dennis Bowman and had always suspected him, made the comparison possible. The DNA from the Doyle crime scene matched Dennis Bowman. The case broke open. The ethical debates around genetic genealogy are real and important. Questions about whether the volunteer users of consumer DNA databases consented to having their biological information used as a tool in criminal investigations. Questions about the potential for misidentification through family tree errors. Questions about the disproportionate representation of certain demographic groups in the available databases and what that means for the fairness of the technique. These are genuine concerns that the law enforcement community, the legal community, and the technology companies involved continue to work through. But it is also true, factually, specifically, concretely true, that in the Kathleen Doyle case and in the Andrea Bowman case, genetic genealogy was the key that opened a door that had been locked for decades. Two women who would otherwise never have been identified with their killer now have that justice. That is not nothing. That is, for Kathy Turkanian and for the family of Kathleen Doyle, everything. The Doyle family deserves a moment in this telling. Kathleen O'Brien Doyle was 25 years old. Her husband was serving his country as a Navy pilot, deployed far from home, when the person who should have been protecting his wife's safety, the general security of a neighborhood, the ordinary expectation that a woman in her own home was safe, was overwhelmed by the presence of Dennis Bowman. She was raped and murdered. Her case sat for 40 years with no resolution. Henry Lee Lucas, the man who falsely confessed to hundreds of murders and whose confessions contaminated cold case investigations across the country for years, had been associated with the Doyle case in the fog of his lies, which had the effect of obscuring the real perpetrator and misdirecting investigators. It was not until the genetic genealogy work removed that fog that the real perpetrator became visible. For Kathleen Doyle's family, whoever is left of them, wherever they are, the resolution of her case came 40 years after her death. 40 years of uncertainty. 40 years of no name, no face, no conviction attached to what happened to their daughter, their sister, their mother. And then the name Dennis Lee Bowman. And then the 2 life sentences. And then the additional sentence for what he did to Andrea. There is a bitterness in justice that arrives that late. And there is also, genuinely, something that resembles relief. The bitterness and the relief coexist without canceling each other out. They exist, as they always do in cases like this, at the same time. The 2022 sentencing hearing was a convergence of all the grief and all the determination and all the years of work that this case had required. Kathy Turkanian was there. Investigators who had worked the case for years were there. Dennis Bowman was there in person, not on a video screen, not in a written statement, but physically present, in the room, at the table. 75 years old. The weight of what he had done settling on him. Finally, in the form of a judge's words and a court's sentence and the faces of the people in that room who had spent years trying to get to this moment. Judge Badger did not spare him. Mr. Bowman is not safe to be in our community, she said. His numerous assaults, his behavior in this case, other convictions all indicate Mr. Bowman is a serious, dangerous man that has harmed many communities, many families. 35 to 50 years, to be served consecutive to the Virginia life sentences. Dennis Bowman is never going home. He is going to die in prison. And the question of what dying in prison means, whether it is justice or merely the exhaustion of options, is one that the families of his victims will answer differently, and that is their right. Kathy, outside the courthouse after the hearing, did not perform satisfaction. She performed grief and relief in the honest combination in which they existed inside her. I'm sad, but relieved he finally told the truth, she said. 10 years of pushing for this moment. A lifetime of carrying the loss of Alexis. And now a sentence, and a legal resolution, and the ability to focus her energy on the thing she had wanted since the identification of the remains confirmed what she had always known. She was going to bring her daughter home. She was going to bury Alexis Miranda Badger with her real name and with the dignity she had been denied in life and in the circumstances of her death. She was going to be her mommy, one final time, in the most concrete and most permanent way available to her. I want to pause here and speak directly to the people watching this who might see pieces of themselves, or their families, or their communities in this story. Because this is not an abstract case. It is not a historical curio from a distant era. The mechanisms that produced this tragedy are alive and functioning right now, in homes and neighborhoods and institutional systems near you. And if you are watching this and something is resonating, something is landing differently than the average true crime narrative because it is too familiar, because the patterns are ones you have seen up close. I want to say something to you clearly and simply. You are not wrong to trust that instinct. If a child in your orbit is showing the signs that Andrea showed, withdrawal, fear, unexplained injuries, the particular sadness of a child who is carrying something too heavy to carry, please do not be the person who files it under adolescent moodiness and moves on. Please be the person who asks the uncomfortable question. Mandatory reporter laws in the United States require certain professionals, teachers, doctors, counselors, social workers, to report reasonable suspicions of child abuse to the appropriate authorities. But mandatory reporting laws have limits, and they apply to specific categories of people in specific professional contexts. They do not reach the neighbor who sees something troubling, the church friend who senses that something is wrong, the teacher who notices the injured wrist but doesn't feel they have enough to file a report, the friend who receives a disclosure and doesn't know where to take it. These people are not bound by law, but they are bound by the same human obligation that bound everyone who moved through Andrea's world and failed to save her. If you see something, you say something. And if the something is a child who is telling you that an adult in their life is hurting them, the answer is not to wait for more evidence or to consider whether the child might be exaggerating. The answer is to make the call. The answer is to be wrong in the direction of protection rather than wrong in the direction of inaction. The National Child Abuse Hotline is 1-800-422-4453. It operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and every call is confidential. If you have a concern about a child, that number exists for you. Use it. Andrea Bowman told the people around her what was happening. She told Jennifer Jones. She told authorities. She told her mother. And the response was insufficient. You have the opportunity to be part of the response that is sufficient if the moment ever comes for you. Now let's continue. Because there are pieces of this story that we have not fully examined, and they matter. One of those pieces is the role of the internet and the true crime community in keeping Andrea's case alive. I have already mentioned Kathy's Facebook page and the role that Coppelman played as a forensic artist and amateur investigator. But the broader ecosystem, the forums, the true crime podcasts and YouTube channels that covered the case, the Reddit threads, the web sleuths posts, the digital communities that formed around unsolved cases in the 2000s and 2010s, played a role that is genuinely worth examining. The democratization of cold case investigation is one of the more unusual social phenomena of the internet age. Before the internet, cold cases were, by and large, the exclusive province of law enforcement and the immediate families of victims. The information that existed about a case was either in a police file or in the memory of people who had been directly involved. It did not circulate widely. It did not find its way to the person who had the crucial piece of the puzzle that the investigators were missing. It sat. It aged. It faded. The internet changed this fundamentally by making it possible for information about cold cases to circulate to the people who might have something to contribute, and, crucially, by making it possible for those people to find each other and pool their knowledge. In Andrea's case, this process produced some genuinely valuable outcomes. The friends and former classmates who found Kathy's Facebook page and shared their memories were people who might never have found a formal mechanism for contributing to the investigation. They remembered things, specific incidents, specific conversations, the specific texture of what life had been like inside and around the Bowman household, that had nowhere to go before the internet gave them a place to go. That information helped Kathy build her case. It helped build the public record. It kept the case visible in ways that eventually contributed to the renewed official investigation. But it also produced the more complicated dynamics that citizen investigation always produces. There were people online who were certain they had identified additional suspects. There were people who posted information about the Bowman family that may have been accurate and may have been exaggerated or false. There were emotional, sometimes accusatory exchanges in the forums. There were people whose involvement was genuine and constructive, and people whose involvement was more about the satisfaction of participation than about the actual advancement of justice. Sifting through all of that, identifying what was useful and what was noise, required judgment, and Kathy, to her enormous credit, exercised that judgment throughout. Carl Coppelman's work deserves particular acknowledgement for its quality and its integrity. His forensic reconstructions were not the speculative, attention-seeking productions that some amateur investigators generate. They were technically careful work, rooted in the actual methodology of forensic art, submitted to and taken seriously by law enforcement professionals. The connection he made between the Wisconsin Jane Doe and Andrea, though it turned out to be incorrect, was made responsibly, with appropriate caveats, with the acknowledgement that DNA testing was required to confirm or refute it, without the inflammatory certainty that can cause harm when it turns out to be wrong. He was, in the amateur investigative community, a model of how that kind of engagement can be done well. The Wisconsin Jane Doe connection, when the DNA came back negative, was disappointing but not devastating. It had served a purpose. It had brought the case to Kathy's attention and given her a specific investigative thread to pull. The pulling of that thread, even when it led to a dead end, opened the larger investigation in ways that ultimately proved essential. This is a feature of cold case investigation that is not often discussed. The dead ends matter. The leads that go nowhere still move the case. They eliminate possibilities. They force the people working the case to sharpen their focus. The Wisconsin Jane Doe was not Andrea, but the investigation of whether she might be contributed to the momentum that eventually found Andrea under the concrete in Hamilton. And speaking of Hamilton, let me tell you something about that concrete slab that has stayed with many people familiar with this case. When investigators had searched the Bowman property in prior years, the concrete slab had drawn attention. Not enough attention to act on, but attention. People close to the case have described it as one of those features that just sat there in the mind of anyone who thought seriously about where Dennis Bowman might have hidden what he was hiding. A permanent, sealed surface in a backyard, poured years ago and never particularly explained, never removed, always present. The investigators who had circled it without being able to go further have described the experience of knowing, in the professional gut-level way that experienced investigators sometimes know things before they can prove them, and being unable to act on that knowledge because the law requires proof before you can remove someone's concrete. The proof came from Bowman himself. In the end, he was the one who told Brenda where Andrea was. He was the one who led the investigators to the slab. This is not unusual in cases where a killer is finally cornered. The impulse to confess, when it comes, sometimes produces the very evidence that seals the conviction. Whether his motivation was guilt, or the desire to control one final narrative element, or simply the exhaustion of decades of carrying a secret while the world closed in around him, is ultimately not the most important question. The important question was answered when the forensic team found what was under the concrete. The important question was answered when the DNA confirmed the identification. The important question had always been, where's Andrea? And now they knew. Let me talk about what justice looks like in this case, and what it doesn't look like, because I think this is worth being honest about. Dennis Bowman is in prison. He is serving 2 life sentences for Kathleen Doyle and 35 to 50 years for Andrea. He will never leave prison. His victims and their families have formal, legal recognition of the crimes committed against them. The court has spoken. The law has been applied. By every metric that the criminal justice system uses to measure its own success, this case is resolved. But Kathleen Doyle died in 1980. She was 25 years old. She has been dead for more than 40 years. Her husband, wherever he is, lived with the unresolved murder of his wife for 40 years before he had a name to attach to it. Kathleen Doyle's case was clouded for years by Henry Lee Lucas's false confessions, a man who told investigators what they wanted to hear for reasons of his own, whose lies became part of the official record of her case and delayed the identification of her actual killer. The confusion generated by Lucas's confessions was not a minor administrative inconvenience. It was years of misdirection in a family's attempt to find justice. And it raises questions about the culture of confession-seeking in law enforcement, about the pressures and incentives that can lead investigators to accept inadequate confessions and close cases that should remain open. Andrea Bowman was 14 years old. She was killed in 1989. Her body was found in 2020. 31 years of her burial site being within a mile or two of people who suspected where she was. 31 years of her birth mother knowing she had been murdered before she could prove it. 31 years of Kathy Turkanian carrying the weight of that certainty without the capacity to act on it in the way that justice demanded. The sentencing in 2022 was, by Kathy's own description, both relief and sadness. It was justice, but it was justice arrived at after 3 decades of failure. The relief is real. The sadness is also real. These two things do not cancel each other out. What justice looks like in practice, in cases like this one, is also shaped by the specific charge and the specific plea. Dennis Bowman pleaded no contest to second-degree murder for Andrea's death, not first-degree murder, not the felony murder or the first-degree child abuse that was originally charged. The no contest plea to second-degree murder was what the prosecution and the defense agreed to, and it resulted in the 35 to 50-year sentence. Whether the charge accurately reflects the full horror of what Dennis Bowman did to Andrea, the deliberate dismemberment, the methodical concealment, the 30 years of lying, is a question that legal experts and Andrea's supporters have different views on. The practical outcome, life in prison for Bowman, regardless of the specific charge, is the same. But for the people who love Andrea, the charge and the framing of what it reflects about what was done to her is not a matter of legal abstraction. It is personal. There is also the question, the one that haunts the edges of cases like this, of what else Bowman may have done that we do not know about. The 1979 rape he confessed to in 2021. The potential connection to the 1989 child abduction. The profile of a serial predator operating across decades suggests a man whose documented crimes may not be the full extent of his actual crimes. How many cold cases in Michigan and Virginia and wherever else Dennis Bowman traveled in his life might be connected to him? How many families might still be waiting for answers that a more thorough examination of his history could provide? These questions are not rhetorical. They are investigative priorities that, as of the last available reporting, have not all been fully resolved. The resources that were poured into the Andrea case and the Doyle case were substantial and well deployed, but the investigation of a serial predator's full history is an enormous undertaking that requires sustained institutional commitment beyond any single case's resolution. The documentary coverage of this case, the A&E Interrogation Raw episode, the Netflix documentary, Into the Fire, brought the story to audiences who had never heard of Andrea Bowman, never heard of Hamilton, Michigan, never heard of a 14-year-old girl who disappeared from her home in 1989 and was finally found 30 years later under a concrete slab. This kind of widespread coverage has real value. It maintains awareness of how cold cases work and what persistence can achieve. It puts a human face on the statistics of missing persons and the dry language of law enforcement press releases. It makes people care about someone they never knew. It is the platform on which Kathy Turkanian could tell a national audience, "She never said I love you, mommy." And that sentence, heard by millions of people, does something to them. It opens something. It makes Alexis Badger real in a way that a case file cannot. The flip side of documentary coverage is the voyeurism question. The valid concern that telling these stories for entertainment purposes, even in the service of justice and awareness, risks turning victims' suffering into content, turning real families' grief into programming. This is a real tension, and it does not have a clean resolution. What I will say is this. The families who engage with documentary coverage, who consent to interviews and share their stories and put their grief on camera, generally do so because they want their loved one to be known. They want the world to know that this person was real. They want the specific, concrete details of the failure to be documented so that the lesson is understood and the failure is not repeated. Kathy Turkanian, who participated in the Into the Fire documentary, has described wanting people to know Alexis, not as a case, not as a victim, but as a person, as her daughter, as the girl who might have been left-handed or right-handed, who had a voice that Kathy never heard, who never said, "I love you, mommy." That desire is legitimate. That desire is the engine behind Kathy's decade of activism on this case, and it deserves respect. The case also raises important questions about adoptee rights and the rights of biological parents. Closed adoptions, which were standard practice in earlier eras, created arrangements in which biological parents had no legal mechanism to maintain any awareness of their child's well-being after placement. Kathy Turkanian did not know that Alexis had disappeared until 2010, 21 years after the disappearance. 21 years during which she was out there, looking for the truth about her daughter in whatever small ways were available to her, without the legal access to even the basic information that would have enabled her to look. Contemporary adoption practice has moved significantly in the direction of more openness, more communication between biological parents and adoptive families, more recognition of the biological parents' ongoing interest in the welfare of the child they placed. But the Bowman case shows what happens when a closed adoption places a child in a home that is dangerous, and no one who has the biological motivation to inquire is legally permitted to do so. We are coming toward the end of this story now, and I want to spend this final stretch making sure that Andrea Bowman, Alexis Miranda Badger, is seen in her full humanity, not just as a tragedy, not just as a case, but as a person who lived a life and who deserved so much better than the life she got. What do we know about her, beyond the case file? We know she had green eyes and brown hair. We know she was born in New Orleans and came to Michigan as a baby. We know she was funny, in the way that her friends have described. Funny with the particular self-deprecating humor that kids who are dealing with difficult circumstances sometimes develop, using laughter as a buffer, humor as a way of being present in a situation without being fully vulnerable to it. We know she was kind. Friends have described specific acts of kindness, the things she did for other people, the way she paid attention to the people around her. We know she was spirited. We know she had a certain toughness about her, the kind of toughness that comes from having to be tough from an early age, that manifests as a kind of no-nonsense directness in the way you hold yourself and the way you meet the world. We know she loved her little sister Vanessa, even as she was overburdened with the responsibility for Vanessa's care. The love and the burden coexisted, the way they do in families where the distribution of responsibility is not fair, but where the connection between siblings is real. We know she struggled at school in the later period, as the weight of what she was dealing with at home made academic engagement harder to sustain. We know she had friends who genuinely cared about her, and who carried the memory of her for decades with a tenderness that says something about who she was and what she meant to the people who knew her. We know she was brave. She was braver than most adults given the same circumstances. She told the truth about what was happening to her. She told Jennifer Jones. She told authorities. She tried, at 14 years old, to navigate a situation that would have been difficult for a fully equipped adult, using the limited tools available to a child in a closed household with no outside support system that functioned the way it was supposed to function. She fought for herself. She was fighting for herself on March 11th, 1989, right up until the moment that Dennis Bowman ended her ability to fight. Her birth name was Alexis Miranda Badger. Her mother named her that. Kathy had chosen Alexis with the particular intentionality that mothers bring to naming children, a name that carried meaning, that felt like it fit, that said something about the person Kathy hoped and believed her daughter would become. Miranda, Badger. These were names with histories attached to them, lineages, the threads that connect a child to the people who came before her. The Bowmans renamed her Andrea. That name was not bad in itself. Many people in this story knew her as Andrea and loved her as Andrea. But the reclamation of Alexis by Kathy after the identification of the remains was not petty or territorial. It was a statement about who this child had been before she was placed in that house, and who she would be remembered as going forward. It was the restoration of something that had been taken. Kathy was able, following the legal proceedings, to take custody of Alexis's remains. The long fight for custody, navigating the legal processes of a state where Brenda Bowman still technically had a claim as the adoptive mother, was handled with the tenacity that Kathy brings to everything. Alexis came home to her mother. Not to Michigan. Not to the backyard in Hamilton. Home to Kathy. Home to the biological connection that had always been there. Invisible and uncommunicated and unbreakable. She was given a proper burial. She was buried as Alexis Miranda Badger. She was given the marker, the ceremony, the acknowledgement of existence that every person deserves. She was buried as a loved person, not as a case file, not as a runaway, not as the secret that Dennis Bowman had kept for 30 years. As a daughter, as Alexis. Kathy told a documentary interviewer that she feels Alexis all around her. This is the language of grief, of the ongoing conversation that bereaved parents maintain with the children they have lost. It is not something that requires validation or explanation. It is simply true, in the way that love is true regardless of the circumstances that surround it. Kathy loved a baby she placed for adoption in 1974. She loved that baby's absence for decades. She fought for that baby's memory when the baby was a cold case. She fought for that baby's justice when the baby's killer was sitting in prison calculating his narrative. She buried that baby 48 years after she was born, and she carries her still. The arc of this story, if you step back and look at it in its entirety, is almost impossible to hold in a single frame. It begins with a teenage mother making an impossible choice and hoping for the best. It goes through the long silence of a closed adoption and the routine evil of an abusive household. It passes through the specific, catastrophic day in March 1989 when a 14-year-old girl tried to protect herself and was killed for it. It runs through the 31 years of a buried secret, a cold case file, a milk carton photograph, a runaway warrant, and the accumulated failure of every system that should have been paying attention. It rises through the unlikely convergence of a forensic artist and a grieving birth mother and a chance meeting between two detectives at a cold case conference. It reaches its legal resolution in February 2022 in a courtroom in Allegan County, Michigan. And then it continues. Because Kathy is still alive. Because the friends who knew Andrea are still alive. Because the investigators who worked the case are still alive. Because the questions this case raises about how we protect children and believe children and respond when children tell us they are being hurt are not answered by a single sentencing hearing, however satisfying that sentencing hearing is. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there are many, but if there is one that stands above the others, it is this: believe children. When a child tells you that an adult in their life is hurting them, believe them. Not uncritically, not without investigation, but with the default assumption that children who disclose abuse are telling the truth, because the research on false disclosures is clear, and because the cost of disbelief, as this case demonstrates in the most devastating possible terms, is catastrophic. Andrea told the truth. The adults who received that truth did not act on it in time. That failure is not a footnote to this story. It is the story. And believe mothers. When a mother tells you that her child's killer is living in plain sight, and she knows who it is, and she has been telling you for years, listen. Not blindly, not without evidence, but with the respect that persistent, specific, evidence-backed certainty deserves. Kathy Turkanian was right. She was right before the DNA confirmed it. She was right before the concrete slab was excavated. She was right in the face of the institutional inertia that makes it hard for official processes to move at the speed that a mother's love demands. She was right, and she stayed right. And she never stopped being right even when being right was painful and lonely and exhausting. She stayed. And eventually, the world caught up with her. We are at the end now. And as we get there, I want to do something that I think this story earns. I want to look at it straight on, without softening anything, without reaching for the neat resolution that nonfiction doesn't always allow. Because the truth is that this story does not have a comfortable ending. There is a verdict and a sentence and an identification and a burial. There is the legal machinery of justice having run its course and produced its outcome. But there is no comfortable ending. There is no version of this where Alexis Miranda Badger is anything but dead, killed at 14 by the man who was supposed to be her father, buried under concrete for 30 years, identified through the painful persistence of a mother she never knew and a forensic artist who never met her, and two detectives who happened to be at the same conference at the right moment. That is the truth of it. And the truth deserves to be held without flinching. What does this story ask of us, as people who have just spent hours listening to it? What does it ask of us when we turn off the screen and go back to our lives? I think it asks different things of different people. For some of you, it asks renewed attention to the children in your orbit, the willingness to look past the surface performance of ordinary family life and ask whether the children you know are actually safe, actually heard, actually believed when they say that something is wrong. For some of you, it asks a harder look at the institutions you trust, the adoption systems, the child protective services, the law enforcement agencies, the schools and churches and community organizations that are supposed to be the safety net for children who are falling. For some of you, It asks a kind of uncomfortable self-examination about the times you saw something and didn't say something, or heard something and didn't pursue it, or noticed something and filed it under somebody else's problem. None of us are monsters. Most of us are people who are doing our best with the information and resources we have. But this case makes clear, in the specific and devastating language of what actually happened to a specific child in a specific place over a specific span of years, that doing our best is not always enough. That the gap between our best and what was needed is where children fall. And that the work of narrowing that gap, through better laws, better institutions, better personal practices, better collective attention, is not finished. It will not be finished until no child is buried under the concrete of a man's lies while the world walks past and does not ask the right question. Dennis Bowman is 75 years old. He is in prison in Virginia, serving 2 life sentences for Kathleen Doyle, with a 35 to 50-year Michigan sentence waiting to follow. He is not going home. By actuarial probability, he will spend the remainder of his life in prison, which means that he will die in prison. Whether that constitutes justice depends on your philosophy of justice. Whether you believe in its punitive dimension, its rehabilitative dimension, its incapacitative dimension, the dimension that is simply about keeping a dangerous person away from potential future victims. What is inarguable is that Dennis Lee Bowman can no longer hurt anyone. The communities of Holland and Hamilton and the broader world are safer with him inside than they were with him outside. That is a real and meaningful outcome. Brenda Bowman lives with what she knows now. The details of her life in the years following the revelation of her husband's crimes are not extensively documented in publicly available sources. What is documented is her courtroom testimony, the account she gave of the conversation she had with Dennis after his arrest, the admission that she had not believed Andrea when Andrea accused Dennis of abuse. Whatever Brenda carries from this story is hers to carry. It is not a small thing. It is, by any measure, an enormous and complex and painful burden. To have stood by a man, to have built a life with him, to have lived above a child's grave without knowing it, to have been the woman who was there when a child needed an advocate and was not that advocate. The accounting for that is personal and ongoing and beyond the scope of what a courtroom can fully address. The investigators who worked this case carry it differently. Detective Todd Workman, who was on the case for years, who conducted the interrogations, who was there when Bowman directed them to Andrea's location. These are the people who understand most fully what it costs to pursue a case like this, the long years before the break, the grinding patience of surveillance and warrants and interviews that go nowhere, the specific emotional weight of a case involving a child. The resolution brought them something. Not peace, exactly, but the professional closure of having done the work and had it matter, of having been the person still looking when the door finally opened. Carl Coppelman, the forensic artist whose obsessive attention to the NAMUS database and whose recognition of the potential connection between the Wisconsin Jane Doe and Andrea helped bring Kathy into the investigation and restart the public momentum of the case. His work illustrates the extraordinary value that committed, competent civilian engagement can bring to cold case investigation when it is done responsibly. He is not a household name. He does not need to be. His contribution to justice in this case is documented in the record of what happened, in the chain of events that his work helped set in motion, in the voice of Kathy Turkanian saying, "I love Alexis," outside a Michigan courthouse in 2022. And Kathy Turkanian, who was 14 when she ran away from her own hard circumstances, who was a teenager when she named her baby Alexis Miranda Badger and placed her for adoption with the hope that she was doing the right thing, who was a woman in her 50s when she received a letter telling her that her daughter might be dead, who was fighting for justice in her 60s, who stood outside that courthouse and told the world that it had been a very long, difficult journey, but she did it all. Because she loves Alexis. Kathy is the heart of this story. Not its hero in the conventional sense. She did not crack the case. She did not find the evidence. She did not make the arrest. But she kept the case alive. She kept Alexis's name in the air. She kept the pressure on the institutions that needed to feel pressure. She refused to accept the comfortable story. She refused to let the world forget. And in refusing, she made it possible for everything else to happen. She is her daughter's mother. All the way to the bone. If you have made it this far with me tonight, I want to say something to you directly. You are not just a viewer of this story. You are a witness to it. And witnesses carry an obligation. the obligation to hold what they have seen, to let it change them in whatever way it needs to change them, and to do something with the change. It doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be Kathy level. It can be as small as believing a child the next time one speaks to you. As small as asking a difficult question of a neighbor's kid who seems sad in a way that goes beyond ordinary sadness. As small as knowing the number 1-800-422-4453 and not forgetting it. Alexis Miranda Badger was born in New Orleans in 1974. She had green eyes and brown hair. She had a birthmark on her right hip. She had a mother who loved her from the moment she was born and never stopped loving her and fought for 30 years to bring her home. She was brave. She was funny. She told the truth when the truth was terrifying to tell. She did not run away. She was never a runaway. She was a child who needed the world to hear her, and the world was not ready. But Kathy was. Kathy was always ready to hear her daughter. And now Alexis is home. She was never forgotten. She will never be forgotten. If this story has moved you, and I believe it has, because how could it not? Please hit the like button right now. Please subscribe to this channel so that you never miss another story that matters. Please share this video with the women in your life, your sisters, your mothers, your daughters, the friends you talk to at midnight when the world is quiet and the stories we carry are too heavy to carry alone. And please, in the comments, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what piece of this story is sitting with you that you can't quite put down. I read every comment. This community is real, and it matters, and the fact that you stayed through all of this, that you refuse to look away from the whole of it, that is itself a form of witness that Alexis deserves. This has been Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here for you. I will be back with another story. But tonight, I want you to hold Alexis Miranda Badger in your mind as you close your eyes. Not as a case, not as a tragedy, as a person, as a daughter, as a girl who was here, and who mattered, and who was never forgotten. Good night.